Okay, well, welcome, and I want to thank you all for coming out on this sort of chilly evening in Williamstown, and thank the panelists for making their way long distances, actually, coming from England, and it turned out harder to get here from Washington, D.C. than it did from England. And I want to thank you both for coming into the wilds of Williamstown. This is the second of the events that we're holding this year. The Leadership Studies program has organized to honor the legacy of the late James McGregor Burns, Woodrow Wilson Professor of Government Emeritus, who sadly passed away this summer. And the format for this evening is that I'll introduce the panel and I'll introduce the panelists, and then each of them will speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll ask a couple of questions and invite you to ask questions, and panelists will try to answer them. And afterwards, you'll be able to buy signed copies of their books outside. You may have seen them piled on the table outside. So that's the format for this evening. James McGregor Burns was one of Williams College's most distinguished alumni and faculty members. He graduated from Williams in 1939. After receiving his PhD from Harvard, he taught at Williams for 40 years, from 1947 to 1986, serving several times as chairman of the political science department. He was a decorated World War II veteran, was actually a candidate for Congress from Western Massachusetts, sadly lost. But he became internationally recognized and widely acclaimed as an astute and passionate analyst of American government and politics, especially American political leadership. He wrote nearly 20 books on American government and politics, especially American political leadership and all branches of government, including widely praised studies of John and Teddy Kennedy and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His book, Roosevelt, Soldier of Freedom, was awarded both a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. Jim's 1978 book, Leadership, proved seminal in launching the field of leadership studies by moving the study of political leadership beyond the narrow examination of individual leaders to an analysis of the dynamic between leaders and followers, different forms of leadership, and how different and changing contexts influence both the nature and the effectiveness of political leadership. His contributions to the development of the field has been recognized by the establishment of chairs in his name at several universities, and the University of Maryland named its James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership in his honor. In both his scholarly work and his political activities, Jim was a passionate advocate of democratic governance and of making American government responsive and work effectively to further the well-being and promote equal opportunities for all Americans. His passion and idealism led him to make a number of trenchant criticisms of the current structures of American governance and the political process, and to advance thoughtful proposals for their reform. Although Jim's focus was mainly on American governance and political leadership, I can think of no greater tribute to his legacy and to his commitment, passion, and ideals than to have a pair of distinguished scholars here tonight to discuss leadership within another political system that many would argue also is in need of reform. Russia is back in the news. It's good for enrollments in Russian studies, sadly. And we're indeed fortunate to have here tonight Professor Archie Brown and Dr. Fiona Hill to talk about the now looming figure of Vladimir Putin and all his many images in domestic Russian and international politics. I'll introduce both Professor Brown and Dr. Hill in the order in which they'll be speaking. And then after they've spoken, as I said, I'll invite you to ask them questions. So Professor Brown is Emeritus Professor of Politics and Fellow of St. Anthony's College, Oxford. Over his distinguished career, he's been a visiting professor at Yale University, the University of Connecticut, Columbia University, the University of Texas, and Notre Dame. He's also a fellow of the British Academy. He was an advisor to the British government on Soviet politics during the Perestroika era, and was last at Williams, in fact, in 1985 to talk about the prospects of Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership for reform in the Soviet Union. So perhaps his return here tonight is propitious. He's written widely on Soviet and Russian politics, communist politics more broadly, the Cold War, and political leadership in the modern world. His numerous books include The Gorbachev Factor and The Rise and Fall of Communism, both of which received the Mackenzie Prize awarded by the British Political Science Association. And his most recent book is The Myth of the Strong Leader, Political Leadership in the Modern Age, a broad comparative study of political leadership in the 20th and 21st centuries that shares with Jim Burns a commitment to democratic forms of governance. And copies of this book, I would encourage you to read it, will be available outside after the panel. And as I can personally attest, Professor Brown is also a wonderful and demanding teacher. He was my tutor in Soviet politics at Oxford, and a few years later, he taught post-Soviet Russian politics to my daughter. So the Wagner family and Professor Brown have shared a lot in Russian history together. Dr. Fiona Hill is the director of the Center of the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Between 2006 and 2009, she was the National Intelligence Officer for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Intelligence Council, and earlier was a Director for Strategic Planning at the Eurasian Foundation in Washington, as well as a Knox Fellow at Harvard University. She's a frequent commentator on Russian, Eurasian, and European affairs, and has published extensively on contemporary Russian issues, including 2 excellent books co-authored with her Brookings colleague Clifford Gaddy, The Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold, and Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, the second edition of which has just appeared. And in fact, we have editions before the bookstores. So we're privileged tonight to have those available also on the table outside. And in my view, the latter book provides the most perceptive and best analysis available of the experiences and ideas that have shaped Vladimir Putin's political views and objectives, as well as his mode of leadership. And I'm looking forward to her comments this evening. So please join me in welcoming to Williams Professor Brown and Dr. Hill.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's very nice to be back here, and I'm not sure if in 30 years' time I'll be back again. That would be difficult, but I hope I'll be back again. It might be earlier. It's a great honour to speak at a meeting in honour of the memory of James MacGregor Burns. I never, unfortunately, met him, but I read his work with enormous profit and pleasure, and had the greatest respect for his work. He was a towering and pioneering figure in leadership studies. His distinction between transforming and transactional leaders is one which is widely used. He made clear his liking for leaders who, in the United States, who used the powers available to them, but he never worshipped power for its own sake. There was always a very strong moral dimension to his work. So no admiration for strength or power for its own sake. And that's not a perspective that has much resonance in Russia. If the United States is a country which historically has gone out of its way to divide and constrain power and to put many obstacles in the way of anyone who aspires to wield great political power, Russia embodies a very different tradition, one in which power is admired for its own sake, and people have looked to a strong leader to keep rivals in check, to unite their vast country, and to protect Russia from its enemies. This year in Britain, we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. I was going to say signing, but it wasn't signed, it was a stamp. And it's quite telling, I think, that in Britain, and indeed in the United States, everyone sides with the barons against King John, putting power on the limits of the king. Whereas in Russia, there's been a very different attitude to the historic tensions between monarch and nobility. Russians have had a strong tendency to side even with such a cruel Tsar as Ivan the Terrible, rather than with the boyars. In Soviet historiography, which still has left an impact on popular consciousness, Ivan was regarded as progressive for his time. There are few countries in which the notion that the most basic requirement of a political system is a strong leader is more firmly embedded than in Russia. By a strong leader, I mean what's most commonly meant by that term, an individual concentrating maximal power in his or her hands, and in Russia it's always his, and wielding it decisively. Yet the more power is accumulated in just one leader's hands, the more that leader comes to believe in his unrivaled judgment and indispensability. The more decisions are taken by one individual leader, the less time that person has for thinking through all the problems connected with it, weighing up the evidence in each case. And since there are only 24 hours in the day of even the strongest leader, a lot of power de facto devolves to his unelected aides and advisors. And unsurprisingly, these placemen also favor concentrating more and more power in the office of the top leader. A leader who comes to power in an authoritarian system has not only the possibility of wreaking havoc and imposing suffering within his own country on a scale that could not be perpetrated by even the worst democratic leader, but also with very rare individuals and in conducive circumstances, a greater chance of making qualitative change for the better. Within an authoritarian regime, a more collective leadership is normally a lesser evil than personal dictatorship. Oligarchy is bad, but autocracy is almost invariably worse. As Adam Smith observed 2.5 centuries ago, gross abuse of power, as well as perverseness, absurdity, and unreasonableness, are more liable to be found in the rule of single persons than of larger assemblies. In the Soviet Union, while few of us, I imagine, would wish to idealize the 1920s or the years between Stalin's death and 1985, during those times of more collective leadership, life was less ghastly than in the years when Stalin wielded supreme power from the early 1930s until his death in 1953. But within the post-Stalin and pre-perestroika Soviet era, it was during the years in which Nikita Khrushchev had established personal ascendancy within the leadership that he single-handedly brought the world closer than it's ever been before or since to catastrophic nuclear war by placing Soviet missiles in Cuba. Soviet foreign policy under a more collective leadership headed by Leonid Brezhnev became both more predictable and more cautious. Domestically, in Brezhnev's Soviet Union, highly authoritarian though it was, there were some rules of the game. You could easily become a political prisoner for doing something that would be perfectly legal in a Western democracy, but you had a fairly clear idea, nevertheless, of what was permissible in the post-Stalin Soviet system and what was not. Political arrests were no longer as arbitrary or on the mass scale that they were under high Stalinism. They took place to curb dissident activity, and not because the political police had quotas to fulfill for arrests, or because a neighbour envied your apartment and denounced you. There was a vast difference between life in the Soviet Union in 1937 and 1977, not to speak of 1987, by which time qualitative change for the better was taking place. Attitudes to strong leaders in general and to particular leaders are not immutable. In the case of Russia, we've had since the second half of the 1980s objective studies of public opinion which chart both the changes and some underlying continuities in Russians' attitude to leaders. Well-conducted quantitative research, such as that led by Yuri Levada, and since his death in 2006 by the Levada Center, is capable of distinguishing between the ephemeral and contingent on the one hand, and more firmly held views and values on the other. When Russians have been asked by the Levada team at 5-yearly intervals to choose their 10 most outstanding people of all times and nations, Peter the Great is selected more consistently than anyone else. A Russian scholar, the late Dmitry Furman, observed that people who would be regarded as monsters in everyday life, among whom he numbers Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, have traditionally been regarded as great in Russia, whereas the Tsar who ended serfdom, Alexander II, was not great. Survey research in Russia provides a lot of evidence linking legitimate government to the rule of a strongman. In the year 2000, the Levada team asked Russian citizens which of their leaders in the 20th century they regarded as the most outstanding. The top 5 who emerged were different in many ways, but the one thing they had in common was hostility to democracy. They were at best authoritarian and at worst totalitarian. Joseph Stalin came top, Vladimir Lenin was in second place, in third place was Yuri Andropov, who headed the KGB for 15 years before succeeding Brezhnev from 1982 to 1984 as party leader. In fourth place was Leonid Brezhnev, who headed the Soviet Communist Party for the previous 18 years. And in fifth place was the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Respondents were allowed to name only one person, and the overall assessments concealed important differences related to age and education. Thus, Mikhail Gorbachev came sixth in that survey, with 7% of Russians naming him as the most outstanding Russian leader of the 20th century. But whereas Stalin's support was lowest among the 18 to 24-year-olds and among those with higher education, with Gorbachev it was completely the other way around. He was seen as the greatest leader of the century by 14% of those with higher education. The same percentage from that particular segment of the population who named Stalin as the greatest. Views of the past are highly colored by the present. At a time when the Soviet Union was becoming a freer country by the week, in 1989, there was stronger support for democratic values than there was by the end of the Yeltsin era, by which time there was widespread dissatisfaction with what Russians had been told by their own leaders and by Western leaders was democracy, although there are other ways of categorizing it. For example, in the title of a book by a Swedish scholar, Stefan Hedlund, who called it a bad case of predatory capitalism. In 1989, Gorbachev was still, by a wide margin, the most popular politician in the Soviet Union. It was as late as May-June 1990 that Yeltsin overtook him. But in the year and a half from the summer of 1990 until the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991, Gorbachev's popularity fell precipitously as the shelves of shops became emptier and the most disaffected of Soviet nationalities, emboldened by the Kremlin's new toleration of East European countries becoming independent, moved beyond pleas for a greater autonomy within the Soviet Union to demands for separate statehood. The process of democratization, very popular in the second half of the 1980s, was discredited in the eyes of many Russians, first by the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which is still a matter of regret for most Russians, and second by the growth of extreme inequality and the massive corruption, social dislocation, and political arbitrariness of the 1990s. The Russian political analyst Lilia Shevtsova wrote in 2007, "It is paradoxical that the degeneration of Yeltsin's leadership strengthened demands not for independent institutions as a means of avoiding a repetition of that leadership, but for more powerful authoritarian rule." At times she has despaired of Russian political culture, saying on another occasion, "Our society is demoralized and not ready for institutional democracy," adding, "It's not ready to live in a pluralistic world, it wants to live in the court of the Tsar." Leaders can be especially important at times of transition from authoritarianism to democracy. The depth of their commitment to democratic values is liable in periods of political turmoil to be decisively important in securing a breakthrough and in sustaining it. There were not only powerful vested interests opposed to the radical changes which Gorbachev introduced during the Perestroika era, but also important strands in Russian political culture that could be drawn upon by his opponents. They've been among the underpinnings of the rule of post-Soviet Russian leaders as they have whittled away checks on the power of the top leadership which had emerged in the last years of the Soviet Union and retained democratic forms while removing almost all of their democratic substance. There has been a relapse into modes of conformist thinking whereby it becomes natural as well as prudent not to challenge the authority of the powers that be. In Russia, a leader's supposed popularity is often an effect of his perceived grip upon power. An interview with a woman voter in the run-up to the 1996 presidential election provided an illustration of this. Asked which candidate she supported, she named the Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov, but she said she would be voting for Yeltsin. To the question why, she answered, "When Zyuganov is president, I'll vote for him." So power is deemed to confer authority and in turn commands respect and allegiance. Sivan Krastchev and Stephen Holmes, who reported this interview, observed, "If Vladimir Putin ever becomes just one of several plausible candidates for the post of president, he would no longer be the Putin for whom an opportunistically deferential electorate was eager to vote." Mikhail Gorbachev was not, in a conventional sense, a strong leader, even though he was a path-breaking one. He was not overbearing, and he was willing to make tactical retreats and to absorb criticism. In particular, he didn't fit Russians' image of a strong leader. For a close and particularly astute observer of Gorbachev, his aide and advisor on political reform, Georgy Shakhnazarov, it was precisely Gorbachev's deviation from the Russian notion of a strong leader which precipitated his declining popularity. Shakhnazarov, in his memoir of the Perestroika era, argued that the undermining of Gorbachev's authority began in the spring of 1989 when he presided over the new legislature, the Congress of People's Deputies, and its inner body, the Supreme Soviet, which had come into being as a result of the first competitive elections in the history of the USSR, held in March of that year, March 1989. Wishing to encourage what Shakhnazarov called a culture of parliamentarism, Gorbachev spent whole days chairing the legislature, in effect becoming the speaker, in addition to being head of state and leader of the Communist Party. When, said Shakhnazarov, millions of people sitting in front of their television witnessed some unknown young deputy engaging in argument with the head of state, who patiently explained himself and even took in his stride patent insults, they concluded that nothing good lay in store for the country. In Russia, said Shakhnazarov, from time immemorial, people have admired and even loved severe leaders. It was difficult for them to respect mild and tactful people as rulers. How could they expect such a leader to provide order and security in exchange for which they would willingly serve him? Dmitry Furman, whom I quoted earlier on the contrasting evaluations of Peter the Great and Alexander II, made a similar point about Gorbachev, writing in the newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta on the eve of Gorbachev's 80th birthday in 2011. He wrote, "In a system of evaluation in which the great are Ivan the Terrible, Peter, and Stalin, Gorbachev not only is not great, he is the antithesis of greatness. However," Furman continued, "in a system of evaluation normal for the contemporary developed world, Gorbachev is simply a great ruler and politician, perhaps the very greatest in Russian history." The Gorbachev is, of course, quite widely regarded in contemporary Russia as a weak leader and a failure, above all because the country over which he presided, the Soviet Union, ceased to exist at the end of 1991. The state could have been held together for many more years had he not embarked on the liberalization and democratization of the Soviet system and the transformation of Soviet foreign policy. Gorbachev consciously sought the dismantling of the Soviet system, but he struggled to prevent the dissolution of the Soviet state. He was not, however, prepared to resort to the sustained use of force that would have been required to crush independence movements once expectations were aroused. He resisted repeated calls to declare a state of emergency, meaning martial law. to put a stop to the vociferous process. His guilt in relation to the breakup of the Soviet Union lay in replacing fear by freedoms and in an aversion to shedding blood. Addressing Gorbachev directly a decade ago, Alexander Dugin, a Russian nationalist ideologue who has become increasingly influential in recent years, said that Gorbachev did not have the historic right to allow either the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union to be dissolved. If he had not been prepared to use force to prevent those things, he should have made way for what Dugin called a more decisive patriot. Yeltsin played a leading part in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as distinct from the transformation of the political system and foreign policy, in which the decisive contribution was made by Gorbachev. By playing the Russian card against the Union and declaring that Russian law had supremacy over Soviet law, all Union law, Yeltsin gave huge encouragement to nationalities much more alienated from the Union than most Russians were, since the Soviet Union could be viewed as, and in some respects was, a greater Russia. Yeltsin had a commanding presence and an impulsive political style which fitted Russian notions of a strong leader. He was infinitely more ruthless than Gorbachev, as he showed with the shelling of his own parliament in 1993 and in the wars in Chechnya, 1994 to 96, and again in 1999. Yeltsin came very close to cancelling the 1996 presidential election when opinion polls suggested he would lose. He had a decree prepared to cancel the election, and he didn't issue it only when the main beneficiaries of the sale of Russians' natural resources at knockdown prices, the people who in Russia are called the appointed billionaires, assured him that with their money and their mass media behind him, he could win. By the time Yeltsin handed power over to his chosen successor, Vladimir Putin, who promised him and his family immunity from prosecution, his early popularity had largely evaporated, and he had also done the cause of democracy more harm than good. Many Russians today believe that their country is now led by what Dugin would call a more decisive patriot than either Gorbachev or Yeltsin. I'm going to say very little about Putin, and I've almost finished, and Fiona Hill will say much more about him. Putin has curbed both independent media and independent political organizations. Like Yeltsin, he has also done a disservice to the development of democracy in Russia by holding that the president should be above party. He was for a time the designated leader of the pro-Kremlin political party, United Russia, but without actually joining it. A president or prime minister in a democracy is, of course, no less the national leader, acting in the interests of the people as a whole, as he or she perceives them, for belonging to a political party. A chief executive's party membership is no threat to an emerging democracy. It is the absence of serious, competing and autonomous political parties that prevents democracy from taking root. Party membership constrains as well as empowering a head of government, and so leaders more interested in maximizing their personal power than in building democracy are tempted to remain above party. And Putin has got not the slightest interest in building democracy in any sense that would be understood in theory or practice in the West. If, however, the popularity of a country's leader were to be the main criterion of democracy, there would be few more democratic states in the world today than Russia. Putin's popularity was higher at the end of last year than it was at the beginning, latterly over 80%, and that, according to the survey research of the Levada Center, which, as I mentioned earlier, is an independent organization, objective and independent, and for that very reason under threat today in Moscow. Russia's response to the Ukrainian crisis, its annexation of Crimea, and the sense that Russia and Russians were not going to be pushed around in the post-Soviet space, have simply added to Putin's popularity. Of course, it's easier to be popular if those who would point to the possible downside of your actions are given little or no access to the mass media, and if political opposition is severely restricted. A system of personalized power has been re-established in post-Soviet Russia. Even when Putin allowed Vladimir Medvedev to keep the presidential seat warm for him for 4 years, while he took the constitutionally less powerful post of prime minister, Putin was the patron, Medvedev was the client, and most people knew it. A popular leader is not in any case a necessary condition of a democracy, still less a sufficient condition. An accountable leader is a necessary condition. The fundamental requirements of democracy are a genuinely competitive party system, free and fair elections, a legislature that can criticize the government and hold it to account, and a rule of law administered by an independent judiciary. It would be difficult to argue that any of these essential features of democracy are present in contemporary Russia. Russia has never been a fully fledged democratic state, and in important respects it's less democratic today than it was in the last 3 years of the Soviet Union's existence. Western policy is not entirely blameless for this outcome. We too have pinned our hopes on the strong leader. Old Boris, as President Clinton used to refer to Yeltsin in the 1990s, and the early Putin, who was much admired in the West. We've put our faith in leaders rather than paying close attention to what was and what was not happening with Russian institutions and to Russian perceptions of our own often far from wise actions. Meantime, many Russians, including some who enthusiastically embraced democratic ideals just a quarter of a century ago, have once again placed their faith in the false god of the strongman. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd better explain that there's not a conspiracy of strange people from Northern England going on here, but by some flukish chance, both Archie and I are from the same part of the world. As he was here at Williams in 1985, giving his first lecture here, and I'm sure it's going to be part of many series to come. I think you're selling yourself short. I can see you here in the next 30 years again. I was just starting to learn Russian in St Andrews in Scotland, not too far from where Archie was from. And just as a little background on that, I thought at the time when I first decided to study Russian that maybe I'd made a bit of a mistake. And I went into the career services worrying a little bit. I'm sure a lot of you feel like this, for some advice and thinking, was this a good idea? Was this a good time to be learning Russian? It didn't really seem to be one of these things on an upward curve. And this is about the time when, of course, Gorbachev had come in, and people basically said, no, we think actually something is about to happen. So it was one leader, Gorbachev, that convinced me to keep on studying Russian. And now here we are with Vladimir Putin, as Archie said, the very antithesis of Mikhail Gorbachev. And I'm hoping, however, that for the next 30 years I won't be writing books about him. It seems that Putin, however, could be with us for some considerable period of time. So I'm hoping to stop with the second edition, but Putin seems to, at least, even according to the polls, be perhaps set now to be with us out until 2024. In fact, the same Levada polls that Archie talked about in his presentation, and all the time that they have been polling on Putin, they've also asked lots of questions about who would people like to see as their leader in the future. And they do these in time sequences. If the election was held tomorrow, who would you vote for if the election was held a few more weeks, or if the election was held in a period of time? And Putin actually looked like he was in trouble. A couple of years ago, when he decided that he was going to regain the presidency from poor old Dmitry Medvedev back in September of 2011, when he rather unceremoniously told a hall of people like this that I'm coming back, much to everyone's shock. And if you looked at Medvedev's face, he probably just learned on the walk into the hall, the way that he'd come in with him. Some of these surveys from Levada, when they asked the question about would you like to see Vladimir Putin, your president, in the next sort of sequences on, only about 22% of people said yes. In the most recent poll, it's up to around 55%. So, as Archie has said, there's quite a lot to be said for the popularity, but it's also when people can't think of any alternatives. And back in 2011, before Putin made the announcement that he was coming back into the presidency, people actually could see alternatives. And the one thing that Dmitry Medvedev did, interestingly enough, because he and I are almost exactly the same age, was he started to talk about a new perestroika. And what he meant by that was a pluralism of the system. And he actually thought that he had been given permission by Vladimir Putin to put this into action, because Putin himself, when he made the handover from himself to Medvedev and put himself into the prime minister position, he made a great deal of talk about the fact that he wanted to have a different system. He actually said, it is unhealthy for a system to have all power concentrated in the hands of one man. That was Vladimir Putin himself. I heard him say this in person at a meeting I was at with a bunch of other experts. And then he went on to say this in other kind of public settings. Obviously, he changed his mind, and he thought after a period of time it had to be better in his hands, that he are the only hands that actually can assure the situation. So with this in mind, I want to pick up on some of the things that Archie had said, and also in the memory of the Professor James McGregor Burns, who this is named after. It's also a great Scottish name. I don't know quite what's going on here, but anyway, perhaps there's a Scottish theme and we should all be... and in fact, Archie, one of the things he's talking about now is about the future of Scotland in the United Kingdom. We were talking about this on the way over. So if anybody wants to talk about Scottish independence, we're all ready for that. Clearly, the legacy of leadership is important here too. But the most important issue about Putin is that as a result of him being such a dominant leader, we've really got a hyper-personalized system, just as Archie said, in a way that hasn't really been since Stalin, which is not to say that Putin is Stalin. But in that light, it's very difficult to understand the person that we're dealing with. And usually leadership studies are really quite academic. But with Mr. Putin, it's actually very difficult to use that approach, because Putin has spent most of his career having spent his formative years in the KGB of really trying to hide even some of the smallest details about his life, and certainly also about what he thinks. As one senior US official said in a meeting I was in recently, everybody is trying to figure out what Putin thinks and what he's going to decide, and nobody has a clue. So I've tried with my colleague in this book to sort of get at a way in which we might be able to figure some of this out, but I have to honestly also say I do not know what's going on in Vladimir Putin's mind. But at the same time, we make a lot of very dangerous judgments about Putin based on the little bit that we know about him and on the way that he acts. In terms of underestimating him in some respects and then overestimating him. So I want to talk about this so that we can understand in many respects his limitations, because ultimately the point I'd like to leave us with at the end is really the point that I think that Archie is making, certainly is the title of his book, which is The Myth of Strong Leadership. Because really, a leader can only be really that strong, and it's all very much contingent, dependent on an awful lot of factors. And Putin has made his strength very much dependent on this political culture, this deeply embedded image of the strong leader, the strong Tsar, which he's acting out in many respects, but also on popularity and on charisma. Which is, as we know, a very difficult thing to maintain. And when Putin came back into office in 2012, after the protests that had basically framed his inauguration in May of 2012, his popularity was at, for him, an all-time low, 64%, which of course isn't much of an all-time low. But if you actually started to pass the election results, you realise that in terms of his active support, it was well under 50% and probably in the upper 40s. Which is not sufficient for the kind of leadership that Archie has laid out. And that takes into account the turnout in the elections and the votes in critical places. And certainly in Moscow, the capital city of Russia, Putin was polling, and indeed people were voting well under 50%. So in the absence of an alternative, people are still not that satisfied with him. And what has propelled him into the stratospheric 80 and above percentage points is really, as Archie said, the actions in Ukraine and Crimea. And one has to ask how long you can keep that up. Now, in terms of these traits about Putin and the ways in which we have underestimated or overestimated him, I want to see a few things here. First of all, in the West, we've really underestimated the kind, at least initially we have, I think we've pretty much got the image of this quite clearly now, about the kind of leader that Putin is. He's certainly one who seems to have modelled himself off that idea that Archie was picking up about Ivan the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Grozny, which is really Ivan the Fearsome. And that's what Putin has tried to, I think, in many respects, portray a sense of fearsomeness, a sense of intimidation. I want to talk about this for a while. Because Putin has been pretty ruthless, actually, in terms of his leadership. Not on the scale of Stalin. This is not Stalin, this is not the Gulag, there's not millions of people being dispatched. But he has been certainly ruthless in his determination to decapitate opposition by singling out individuals for some pretty harsh treatment in the current circumstances. And then there's some other really rather interesting dynamics here. Archie said at the beginning of his speech that the image of a strong leader in Russia tends to be very male, and I want to dwell on this for a little while as well. In actual fact, there was one woman who was quite powerful. I'm sure all of you are thinking of this, Catherine the Great. Noticing, of course, she was a German. She wasn't really Russian at all. She was a German princess who proved to be pretty ruthless as well, and Putin seems quite fond of her. And interestingly enough, Putin's foreign language is also German. And so the last time there was somebody who was so influenced by German and by Germany in the Kremlin, it was actually a woman, Catherine the Great. And what we've seen over the last year has actually been a rather curious dynamic that I think really gets to the heart of some of the issues that I want to talk about Putin. In the crisis over Ukraine, the West's main interlocutor with Vladimir Putin has also been a German woman, Chancellor Angela Merkel. And this is somewhat reminiscent, if we go back to the 1980s, of the role that Margaret Thatcher played in terms of negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev about a fresh start in Soviet-Western relations. If you recall, Margaret Thatcher said about Mikhail Gorbachev that he was a man that we can do business with. That's actually not a line I don't think Angela Merkel would use about Putin. She'd probably say something much ruder, but it would be in German, so my German's not very good, so I wouldn't understand that. But in any case, back in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was not the lone woman who was dealing with the Soviet leader. There was, of course, Ronald Reagan, and there was a whole host of other European leaders, mostly men. Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, just like Catherine the Great in her time as the Empress of Russia, was something of a lone woman on the international stage. And today, Angela Merkel is the most powerful political figure in Europe and also the lead for the transatlantic alliance, but she's also not the lone woman. There are women in politics at the highest level of politics in the United States, in the EU and Europe, especially in dealing with Russia. At Brookings this week, we hosted Federica Mogherini, who's the new High Representative of the European Union for foreign policy, who replaced Catherine Ashton in this post. We had in the United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was the main interlocutor with the Russians as well. She was famously in charge of the reset with Russia. It obviously hasn't worked out quite as she would have hoped. She's been replaced by John Kerry, but behind John Kerry, the main people in dealing with Russia are our National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, the UN Permanent Representative of the United States, Samantha Power, and the Assistant Secretary for Europe, Tori Newland, all women. I'm going somewhere with this, just bear with me for a moment. In terms of the Ukraine crisis, we have the IMF playing a very important role in terms of talking about the bailout, and we have at the head of that Christine Lagarde, another woman, a French woman. And as the economy has taken a downturn, the Eurozone crisis has gone on in Europe, we're getting, particularly in French politics, at the head of one of the most powerful populist parties, another woman coming to the fore, Marine Le Pen, the head of the Front National. So the point of this is that across the board in Europe, we have women leading political parties, countries, and also foreign and defense departments, if I went down the list. In Russia, in stark and very telling contrast, we actually don't have any women at all in the political and national security environment around Vladimir Putin. However, there are two very prominent women in Russia right now in the central bank. Both the governor of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, and the deputy governor of the central bank, Ksenia Yudayeva, are women. However, they are not decision makers, and I think we've seen, if any of you have been reading about this in the press, that they have actually been tasked with cleaning up the mess in the economy rather than making any decisions about the strategy. And there are some rather telling photographs of some of their encounters with other men across the political system that underscore the fact that they're not making decisions. Putin's even got rid of the woman at home. Remember the wife, Lyudmila? Remember Mikhail Gorbachev's wife, Raisa, the First Lady of Russia, was very prominent throughout the whole of the perestroika period. There was very much this sort of sense that the two of them were there together. We've never seen Ludmilla, or very rarely seen Ludmilla, apart from when they announced at a night at the Ballet of the Opera that they were about to get divorced. Putin actually has 2 daughters, but no one knows very much about them. They're also not being part of the picture. And one Russian commentator, Nina Khrushcheva, coming back to Nikita Khrushchev. Nina Khrushcheva is Nikita Khrushchev's granddaughter and a professor here in the United States, the New School. She once quipped in an article and also in a presentation that in Russia the First Lady position had actually been handed over to a man. Her argument was that poor old Dmitry Medvedev was not even president when Putin was prime minister. He was actually the First Lady. He was the man having tea and cookies with dignitaries, basically the First Lady role in her view, while Putin kept all the power, as Archie said. So the important point that I want to make here is that Putin's Russia is a very male Russia. It's part of this image that Archie is talking about. But it's become refined in a way. You can't really say that Yeltsin and that Gorbachev, and Brezhnev certainly not, or Andropov, were really playing this overtly male role in the way that Putin has. And I want to just dwell on this for a moment. Whereas after the first edition of the book on Mr. Putin, I ended up in a very strange set of correspondences with some senior Russian business people, and then in also some very odd discussions with people from the Kremlin circles, who wanted to get across to me that, you know, being an academic and not really being in their mix, that I'd failed to grasp how alpha male Putin and the Russian system are. They actually told me that instead of really referring to Putin as the Tsar in their inner circle, which is one of the titles that he's been, you know, given most recently, that they actually talk about him using the term Patsan. Now, for those of you who are not Russian speakers in the audience, I want to explain this a little. It's not something, a term that one would normally use, and I can see a couple of people here chuckling, but this is used, let me say, a former chief of staff of the Kremlin used this exact term to me in talking about Putin. And the way that we might describe it in the UK is a bloke, a lad. It's also known in Russian as a brother, bratok. And, you know, you can I think, go somewhere with this. One particular gentleman used this with me, said that we need to think more Goodfellas in the kind of Ray Liotta sense, if anyone's seen that movie, a kind of a made man in the mafia. Patsan is a slang term that's used to refer to a member of a semi-criminal group or a gang. The popular image in Russia of a Patsan is a tough guy in his early 20s sitting about in a tracksuit, eating sunflower seeds and drinking beer, which is not exactly, again, what you would think of as Vladimir Putin. And it's not usually the kind of thing that you write about in academic books, and it's not really featured in this book. But the point of this is that this is the inner circle that talks to each other about each other in these terms. It gets to the very point that Archie was making and just illustrates it in a kind of a more real way about how tight, how narrow this circle is around Putin, and just the nature of this leadership, how personalized it is, just to the fact that people refer to Putin as the Patsan. And Putin himself has frequently spoken in terms like this. So Patsan describes, in many respects, the current Russian system. Putin is sitting at the heart of a band of brothers. Everyone in his circle is actually related to him in one way or another too, not necessarily by being family, although Putin's nephew is out there in some of these circles, but everyone's part of what you might call a one-boy network, a tight group of men who have relationships with Putin that extend back to Leningrad and St. Petersburg, where he grew up and started off his career in the KGB, but also was deputy mayor, and also back to his time in Dresden, East Germany, when he was posted there with the KGB in the 1980s. One thing to bear in mind about Putin is he missed perestroika. He missed it almost entirely. From 1985 to 1990, Putin was in Dresden, East Germany, working with the Stasi to steal technological secrets and also keep an eye on Western business people and on the opposition in East Germany. He just completely missed it. And if you think that the KGB had lots of information, in East Germany at the time, Erich Honecker was paranoid about Gorbachev's perestroika, and he actually banned a lot of the Soviet newspapers. And in Dresden, it was in one of these rather strange settings where they actually couldn't pick up TV and radio from other parts of Germany. So Putin was in a rather strange, rarefied environment, and as he says in his autobiographical works, he actually missed what was going on back at home, and when he came back, the country was in a state of collapse. It was on basically the brink of the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of 1990. So when Putin thinks of perestroika, He just thinks of the ruin that he saw when he came home. He thinks about nothing about the pluralism and about the opening up of the system, and there's nothing positive for him in this. So Putin's whole mindset is also coloured by the lack, in many respects, of that experience, and also of always working in a very tight cohort, a secretive inner circle of people. And again, many of the people that he has brought with him into the Kremlin who work with him come from these different settings of tight groups of people in a circle who work together. Now, one of the taboos within this network, as my interlocutors have frequently stressed, is letting a woman have their way. And again, I want to mention this because Angela Merkel has been, up until now, until she and Putin have had a falling out, our main interlocutor with Putin. And many of the people that I talked to and interviewed for the second edition of the book got themselves really worked up about the personal national insult of appearing weak in having to deal with a woman. It gets back again to some of the points that Archie was brought out. So this is more of a kind of an informal set of references, basically supporting the points that he's made. And the language of Russian diplomacy these days is the language of force. When you listen very carefully to what Putin says in Russian, you will note that his language is crude, it's brutal, and it's very deliberately male. Putin, for example, is obsessed, including in public references to balls. Now, I don't put this in the book, so don't worry about this. But the point is that Putin likes to talk about hanging people up by them. He's used this about Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia. He's used it also about poor Manuel Barroso, the former head of the European Commission, who doesn't seem like a very offensive man in any ways. But Putin has over the course of the crisis in Ukraine also told Barroso apparently that he would hang him up to it by his most sensitive parts if he didn't back off on Ukraine. Now, Putin is not the only misogynist in world politics, but the point is he's doing something with this language. He's making a point. This is not accidental. Vladimir Putin is not the kind of person who just makes casual quips. He's not the kind of person who's going to back off and say, oops, I didn't mean to say this. Putin wants to make sure that he's being taken very seriously and that this menace in the language that he used gets everyone, male or female, to know that he will make good on every promise and every threat. That's the reason of using this kind of prison slang jargon and referring to Putin as the Patsan. It's a very different and very focused kind of leadership and authority translated through language. And right from the very beginning of Putin's biographical materials back to the 1999 and 2000, some of you will have no doubt read Masha Gessen's book, The Man Without a Face. She has a whole chapter about Putin as the little street thug. Putin has spun stories about himself as being a scrappy little fighter who will basically fight dirty to win. And he's talked about himself fighting in the streets of Leningrad when he was growing up as a kid. The whole point of these biographical materials was against the backdrop of the Second War in Chechnya. He wanted to make sure that everybody understood that he would not back down, that he would fight till the end. And he's now giving us the same set of impressions in Ukraine. So Putin uses PR, he uses the media, he uses propaganda, and he uses language to basically enforce a certain image of leadership. An image of a leadership that won't be pushed about. All of his pronouncements, even the crudest ones, are highly orchestrated and they're very well prepared. Another thing that he does very carefully is make it very difficult for people to understand what he might think or what he might do next. This is also very deliberate. It's part of the whole task of Putin, which is keeping Russia, in his view, and himself one step ahead. The way that he does this, of course, is to make it very difficult for any of us to figure out what he's talking about, what he's thinking, what he's saying to people. It gets back to the point that I said at the beginning about US officials saying that they have no idea about what Putin is thinking. And every appearance that Putin has is highly orchestrated. He never goes out into public without basically checking out who's in the audience. He would have already, if this was a kind of a case of a press conference, be figuring out who was likely to ask a question. Most of them have been scoped out beforehand. I've got some first-hand experience of this. The whole point is that Vladimir Putin, as part of this leadership profile, is meant to be unknowable to the people from the outside. This helps him keep one step ahead of any opponent, either on the domestic front or internationally. Now, this tactical prowess of Putin is part of his popularity. It's part of the base of his popular support in Russia. The Russian public loves the fact that Putin improvises and can even change his positions at the last moment. We say he's not a strategist, he's a tactician. But that's only because we can't figure out what he's going to do next. And the Russian public actually love that. It shows in many of the polls that Archie has referred to. So against this backdrop, we're now trying to get Putin, in the case of Ukraine, under the pressure of sanctions, to back off, to basically change his mind. And he keeps signaling for us that he won't be doing this. It's part of this whole image of leadership. It would be actually fatal for Putin to make any concession and to step back. And especially given the language that he has created and this sense of unity in a very tight group of men that he has also created. And he's certainly not going to back down in the face of any kind of concession push by Angela Merkel. Getting back to my earlier point in Germany, that's been made very, very clear. So we're going to have to actually think very hard about how we play the diplomatic game with Putin and with Russia in the future. Putin right now is set on making new deals at home with the inner circle. He isn't King John with the robber barons and the Magna Carta. It's quite the opposite. He's sitting down with the robber barons, the oligarchs, and making sure that they pay attention to what he is saying. He's preparing them all for tough times ahead. He's preparing the Russian public for tough times ahead, blaming everything that's happened in the Russian economy on sanctions and on the West. And also the steep drop in oil prices is one of the factors there, but that's been spun in the Russian press as a conspiracy by the US and Saudi Arabia. So again, another way of pushing things off. So Putin is making tactical shifts. He's adapting to new circumstances. He's playing tough. He's looking for ways to inflict punishment on Ukraine and the United States. He will not soften up. He will not step back. It's, again, a very different style from Gorbachev in the 1980s, who, as Archie said, was always looking for some kind of compromise. Back in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was facing up with Mikhail Gorbachev, it was Margaret Thatcher who was never going to turn. She was the Iron Lady who would never shift her position. I always say that actually, if you want to think of Putin, the kind of style of leadership, he's the love child of Margaret Thatcher and Dick Cheney. So think of the principles of, don't think about it too much, but think of the principles of Margaret Thatcher and think of the importance of executive power that Dick Cheney impressed within the US presidency. Dick Cheney wanted actually the US president to be much more like the kind of president, not exactly, that we have in Russia, where executive power had a lot less checks and balances on it. This is the kind of style of leadership that Putin is trying to push forward with. So just to basically wrap up, although we would like to see Putin change, Putin has no intention of changing. He's the iron leader, the iron president, the unipolar president. He has very little alternative viewpoints coming into him. He has very few checks and balances. He's playing out a tough guy role that is not going to lead to any compromise. And really what he's trying to do now is to push back, as he sees it, the US threat. He genuinely does believe that the West, and I just want to finish on that, is a threat to his position. It's a threat to Russia in his view, but it's also a threat to his leadership style. Because the type of leadership that we see in Russia today with Putin is not really the type of leadership that has been embraced across the world on a large scale in recent years. Now, I think we can come up with some similar kinds of leaders. President Xi in China seems to be going more in a personalized direction, but he still has very much a collective leadership body behind him with the Communist Party in China. So it'll be debatable about how far he can go in that direction. And we also have basically President Erdogan in Turkey was formerly Prime Minister Erdogan in Turkey, and was very much the kind of figure in a very strong parliamentary political system who had managed to assert a particular style of leadership. And he's certainly been taking the leaf out of Putin's book and trying to turn the Turkish presidency into something more akin to the kind of presidency in Russia. But it's also not clear that he will be able to transform that. So Putin is actually quite a unique individual in current world politics. He's unique because of his background in the KGB, of coming up through the ranks. Yuri Andropov, when he was Secretary General of the Communist Party, had actually been from the Communist Party before he became the head of the KGB. He wasn't from the rank and file of the KGB. And Putin is also quite unique in this particular style of leadership, this one-boy network with him at the center of it. It's deeply rooted in Russian political culture, but Putin has also made it very much his own. He's put his own personal imprint on it. And Patsan Putin is quite a different person from the type of leader that we're usually used to dealing with.
like to thank you both for those enormously illuminating, if somewhat depressing, comments and analysis. And I'd like to exercise my prerogative as the moderator here to ask a couple of questions before I invite all of you to ask Fiona and Archie questions as well. And perhaps I'm coming at this from too much of the perspective of a Russian historian, so I will admit my prejudices and perspective up front. But my questions concern the stability and durability of the current political system in Russia. On the one hand, you've both argued quite persuasively that over the course of the last decade or so, Putin has created a very hyper-personalized and political system based on interpersonal relations and patronage and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that while that's in the short term effective, it also is ultimately unstable in the sense that there is no clear path for succession. And if one looks back in Russian history, in moments when that kind of hyper-personalized political authority existed, it tended to be followed relatively quickly and unpredictably with a sudden collapse and turmoil and so on. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the durability of the system from that perspective. And the second question is slightly different. Again, it comes from my background in Russian history, but it seems that you've both described a political administrative system that's enormously effective, oppressively effective, whatever one thinks of it, and I'm not endorsing it by any stretch of the imagination, but it seems to be incredibly impressive in its ability to control the political situation and shape public opinion and control the populace through the ability to shape opinions and control information and so on and so forth. And that's been, to a large degree, possible in part because of the resources provided by the heavy concentration of the economy on energy, oil and gas. But given the collapse in oil prices and the need for political need as well as strategic and security need for a more vibrant economy, and the argument is that's got to come from growth, both the diversification of the economy, but diversification in the sort of middle-sized economic enterprises and so on and so forth. In the past, when that's happened, in Russian history, and it does happen periodically, and it happened with Gorbachev and Perestroika, the response has been to try to loosen the political administrative system in order to provide the kind of space that allows for greater autonomous activity on the part of society in order to generate a more productive economy. And it seems to me that the political structure and the administrative structure that's been created and is enormously effective to maintain political control really lacks the ability to oversee that kind of the kind of policies that would allow economic reform to take place. And so that there is a potential, it seems to me, either that the system becomes destabilized as the government responds by trying to loosen control, or the populace becomes increasingly dissatisfied by the economic problems created by the failure to reform. So it seems to me that there are two really serious potential sources of instability in the system, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on it.
Okay, well, I think that there's a great deal in that personal dictatorships which are not backed by strong institutions are not as stable as strongly institutionalized authoritarian systems. There is quite a lot of contemporary political science research showing that when there's a ruling party, a serious ruling party, the regime tends to last longer than one which is a personal dictatorship without a ruling party. I mean, there is a ruling party of sorts in Russia, but the party is no longer the serious instrument of rule. Going back to Adam Smith again, I mean, people tend to quote Adam Smith on economists quote him without having read him. And Adam Smith, before he died, got burned when he was on his deathbed, a book he had written on government and jurisprudence, which would have been as great as The Wealth of Nations, but it wasn't quite up to the standard he wanted, so he got his best friend to destroy it. Nevertheless, there are notes of his lectures at Glasgow University in the 1750s and early 1760s, a lot of very perceptive comments on politics. And one of the things he said was that the idea that absolute monarchies are stable is an illusion. They're unstable. He said that Turkey has a sultan who's very powerful and is there, but they change every few years. So I think it's absolutely true that potentially a highly autocratic regime is unstable, especially if it's not backed by strong institutions. It's no accident that communist regimes lasted for so long. And I would argue, not everybody would agree, I would argue that the Soviet communist system would still exist if Gorbachev had not embarked on radical political reform, because the system had very many ways of curbing dissent and a mixture of carrot and stick. And even when the economy was not doing so well, it survived. And of course, they would have benefited from the rise in oil prices after the year 2000, as Putin, luckily for him, did. And that comes to the second question of Bill's, that the oil price, and it is a very, very serious blow for the Russian economy, and one of the reasons for his popularity, Putin's, was rising living standards. And under Yeltsin, people were often not paid in time, pensions were not paid. Under Putin, they were paid in time, they got their pensions, and so a lot of people saw that they were a bit better off, and now that's not going to be so, for a time being at least. However, I don't think that in the short run there's going to be regime change. I also think that if Putin personally were to be deposed for whatever reason, I don't think he'd be replaced by somebody better. I mean, it wouldn't be some kind of liberal Democrat who would come to power. Liberal democratic values, which had a wide appeal in Russia in the end of the 1980s, don't have such an appeal today. And the more antagonistic relationship is between the West and Russia, the more Russian leaders will be able to appeal to patriotism against the foreigners who've always hated us and are trying to do us down. So I don't see any early regime change in Russia, and I don't think that if Putin were replaced anytime soon, he'd be replaced by someone better.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that last point about the more that we're in this wartime scenario, and Putin actually has quite openly said that this is World War III in his view, that this is another war for Europe, but this time it's for Russia's position in Europe. And while we're in that state of high antagonism, there's very little likely to change. But there is, as everybody has said, this inherent instability in a situation where you have, one individual so associated with the power system. I mean, the one terrible scenario from the Russian perspective would be the kind of disaster that we saw with Poland in the airplane crash with 96 of the top Polish figures disappearing. The Polish system actually withstood that. It was a huge catastrophe and a disaster, but it's hard to see how some catastrophe of that kind of scale would not undermine and upend Russian politics. Just as there would be a succession crisis almost in an old Tsarist format if Putin died, if there was some just personal demise. Because we don't have a system in place in the way that Archie's pointing out with the communist system, in which there would be an orderly process of succession. I mean, with Yeltsin too, he went through, obviously, several attempts to find his Vladimir Putin until he latched upon him. You remember that dizzying array, for those of you, watching that at the time, of prime ministers that Yeltsin went through. And Putin obviously had his moment with Medvedev and decided that Medvedev was a little bit too much more like Gorbachev. He was not the image of the hard leader, the hard man that he wants to present. In fact, many people will say about Dmitry Medvedev that he exuded warmth and fuzziness. And I can actually say from my few encounters with him, he was more like the kind of guy who would give you a hug than, basically, people actually have said in interviews that they miss having tea with Medvedev. With Putin, they always wondered what he'd put in your tea. With Medvedev, you felt like kind of ill at ease, So joking aside, Medvedev just also couldn't keep it together in terms of the constraints that the leader is supposed to impose on those around who would actually like to have their hand in the economy. Because for everything that is said about corruption in Russia, the system actually is immensely effective and has been very effective. The reason there hasn't been a backlash against the corruption that people are pretty aware is there at the top is because the pie has been growing. Putin has always made sure that the system delivers. Even though around him there's this tight network, this one-boy network of people that he knows and he's known for an extraordinary long time, he makes sure that they deliver on their promises. This is why somebody like Igor Sechin, who is at the head of the Rosneft company, is at the head of that company and is very much in charge of the energy sector, the most important part of the economy. He's a friend of Putin's, but he's someone that Putin can trust to deliver. Putin makes personal, basically, bonds of trust and of expectation with people. He talks about the Russian word ответственность, which is about responsibility, but it's your personal responsibility. It's not the responsibility that's embedded in institutions. We have Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, which of course has been rocked by decades of violence. And Kadyrov has created a sort of stability of sorts, one that's quite popular from Putin's perspective. But Kadyrov has given personal fealty to Putin, not actually to the Russian Federation or the Russian state, but to Putin personally. So again, this gets to this point of personal responsibility and the personal nature of the system. And that makes it, again, very difficult to think about where it goes from there and how you pluralize that out again. It seems more likely that if something did happen to Putin, the inner circle would huddle together. There is, of course, a constitutional process that's embedded with the Speaker of Parliament and elsewhere, but one can be sure that there would be very much something akin to the times of the Tsars, or when Secretary Generals dropped off with quicker sort of timing than people were anticipating, where there had to be a quick huddle and a decision on who they were going to put in next. But it might look a bit more like the Chavez handover to Maduro in Venezuela, where the preparations haven't really been made in advance of time. And you can see how that has not played out particularly well. The real risks, as Bill and Archie have put their finger on it, is with the economy right now. But one thing to bear in mind about Putin, which I didn't really bring out in my remarks, is that Putin has in his mind uppermost security, not economics. Putin is actually very good, or has been very good at managing the Russian economy, but in a time of high oil price and of growing oil prices. He hasn't had the experience that Yeltsin had and that Gorbachev had of trying to manage an economy in a low oil price environment. He still actually doesn't have the same experience they had, because they were around $10 a barrel. I mean, this is now, in the 50s. Putin, however, I think can actually manage this if oil prices don't continue to fall, and actually even if they stay stagnant, because he's actually not so interested, surprisingly enough, in the diversification of the economy. Again, that was Medvedev who was interested in that. Remember, Medvedev had an iPhone, an iPad, basically he was on Twitter. Putin just doesn't care about the new economy. He doesn't really care about the high-tech, the creative class. In fact, those are the people that he's pushed back out of politics after the opposition. The people who were in the opposition to Putin in 2011 and 2012, when he said he was going to come back, were all the people like all of us here, who wanted to see a more diverse Russian economy, who were in the high-tech sector, who wanted to be managers, who some of them were actually on Kremlin task forces that Medvedev had set up, which made things even worse. They were the people who wanted Russia to be a modern European-style economy. There were hundreds of thousands of them out in the streets, but hundreds of thousands of people, Putin, figured out how to deal with that. And that's where he was ruthless. When I was getting back to the point I made before, he singled out people, not just Alexei Navalny, who has been the poster child for the opposition, but ordinary people like, you who could show up to a lecture, people who might have showed up to a protest. They did nothing but actually show up, and they were arrested. There were a whole host of people, not masses of people in the tens. The girls from Pussy Riot, the punk rock group, who basically made an affront to the Russian Orthodox Church. People like this who were actually pushing for a more kind of countercultural approach, or an unorthodox approach to a more entrepreneurial approach in the economy, but who stuck their necks out. They're the people who were given sentences, charged with hooliganism, sent off literally to a penal colony for a couple of years. There was Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who obviously sat for 2 years in pretty harsh conditions to remind the oligarchs about what could happen to them. So it's that kind of targeted, basically ruthlessness that Putin has been extremely good at, using the force of the law against people, because everyone's done something, in the Russian system, under the current system, that is. You can always find some transgression. You made some unpaid parking tickets, anything, that can be actually used to put a case against you. So he's got rid of that opposition. The biggest risk is the economic downturn. And what Putin is going to do is prioritize the people who count for him, which is not the programmers and the managers and the white-collar workers. It's the people who work in the military-industrial complex, who build the tanks and who work in the big manufacturing sectors. It's the miners, it's the people who would be out on the streets and were out on the streets in the 1990s. It's the pensioners. He's going to make sure that they all have their wages paid, their pensions paid, and if he has to squeeze other parts of the system, he will do that. And it's not the sanctions that's hurting Putin, it's the oil price. So the hope is, of course, that the oil price will come back. There'll be a period of very painful adjustment over the next 2 years. People won't be living as large as they were in the past. But the Russian budget will also be cut to accommodate the new straitened times, and Putin's already preparing people because he knows that this is the danger. And that's going to be the biggest risk, is if that makes a dent in his popularity, but he's going to try to stay one step ahead of that too.
Thank you. So questions from the audience? Yes.
You have someone who is so unpredictable, you don't really know what he's thinking, but he won't back down and he won't compromise. What lessons should we draw for our foreign policy and the foreign policy of the West toward Russia at this point? Would it be prudent to follow a more aggressive policy or a less aggressive policy? What is your view of that? It seems very hard to fashion a policy with someone who is unpredictable and whose thinking you can't really divine. But
I'm not sure if I've heard the question, but is it that will Russia pursue a more aggressive policy?
No, it's whether we should, how we should approach dealing with Putin.
How we should approach in the present circumstances.
Yeah.
I think that we have to be a bit more subtle than we've been. I have some sympathy with the Russian view that a lot of the things that Western countries have done since the end of the Soviet Union have been against the spirit of the end of the Cold War, that with Gorbachev's idea of a common European home did not include the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and into parts of the former Soviet Union. The idea of Ukraine being in NATO is anathema for Russians. So I think that, this is one reason why Putin is popular at the moment, that he speaks for the majority of Russians in this respect. They feel that they were deceived at the end of the Cold War. They thought they were going to enter into a collaborative relationship with the West, and it's been anything but from their point of view. While many recent Russian actions have been reprehensible, including putting troops in Ukraine and denying they're there, there is that question also has two sides, because when people in eastern Ukraine said that we want a federal system, the new Kiev government said federation's out of the question, and in Washington this was echoed, federation's out of the question. The United States had a federal system, but out of the question for Ukraine. And yet that would surely have been preferable to civil war. It led to the annexation by Russia of Crimea, and now civil war in eastern Ukraine. So I think that our policy has got to be more sophisticated than it has been, and to consider Russian state interests as well as our own, because Ukraine is more of a state interest for Russia than it is for the United States or for Britain. And the ties between Russians and Ukrainians go back centuries, are very close. Even people like Gorbachev, who was genuinely wanting to be a partner of the West and was moving Russia in the direction of social democracy, though the process was interrupted. Even he says, I'm half Ukrainian, my wife was Ukrainian, and yet he finds the Western position on Ukraine to be too one-sided. So I think that, yes, some sanctions are desirable, but there must also be dialogue, and I think that we could have exercised influence on the Ukrainian government and perhaps avoided a civil war. Now the two sides are so entrenched and there have been so many casualties on both sides that it's far harder now to bring them together than it would have been at the outset, just after the Maidan Revolution.
There's another element to this, because I agree entirely with what Archie has said. One thing that I didn't bring out in the remarks as I was trying to tie them a little bit more to the way that Archie had framed them, is that Putin actually doesn't understand the West very well. We kind of think of him as this, omniscient KGB officer. And just as we have a hard time kind of penetrating into his mindset, we have to understand that he actually doesn't know ours either. Putin speaks German extremely well. But again, as I mentioned, he was posted in Dresden from 1985 to 1990. That was East Germany under Erich Honecker. It wasn't Germany writ large. It certainly wasn't the Federal Republic of Germany, which he was, trying to spy on. But that's very different from having a German experience of kind of growing up or, being educated in Germany. He speaks German, but he doesn't really understand Germans and Germany. He knows some Germans. Putin tends to approach foreign policy in the same way that he does things at home. He looks for individuals. So he latched on to Gerhard Schroeder, the former Chancellor of Germany. He hasn't done very well with Angela Merkel, because he just doesn't do very well, in dealing with women, unfortunately, either. But he's tried to intimidate her and kind of push her into a box. There's a story about how in his first encounter with her, and this is a true story, he knows that she's scared of dogs because she was bitten by a dog. And so he allowed his dog to come and, in their one-on-one meeting, to come and sniff around her feet and lie at her feet, knowing full well that this would basically really make her uncomfortable, to say the least. It was deliberate. That didn't, kind of set the tone particularly well. This is the kind of approach that Putin tends to take. He tries to look for people's vulnerabilities and use them to figure out how he's going to interact with them. So he's looked for our vulnerabilities. In terms of his understanding of the United States and certainly of the rest of Europe, it's actually very low. Apart from the reports that he gets, prepared by the presidential administration or coming in from the KGB, he's not interested in the dynamics of our societies. He doesn't think, for example, that the US president is actually, particularly President Obama, much more like a prime minister in a coalition politics. He wouldn't even begin to understand some of the things that, Archie was laying out for us there from, the perspectives of the way that politics work. When he sees that Obama can't do something because Congress has blocked it, that he thinks it's part of a game. The most recent incident that we have where Congress has invited Netanyahu to come and speak just after the State of the Union. That is the prerogative of Congress, and of course it's clashing with the executive branch. For Putin, this is just, kind of something that doesn't make any sense unless it's part of an intrigue and a conspiracy that the White House is somehow orchestrating. And that is part of our problem. It's actually a very dangerous situation that we're in with Russia right now. You've really put your finger on it. Putin is convinced that we're out to get him. He's convinced that we overthrow Yanukovych in Ukraine because, that's what he sees. He sees the plots and conspiracies he's been trained to see in the KGB, and he believes that we're out to get him too. He does genuinely believe that the protests in 2011 and 2012 were orchestrated by the United States and the European Union. Now, of course, there's some element to truth to that because we've been funding non-governmental organisations, just like there's some merit to some of the other complaints that the Russians make. And we, as a matter of our policy, do democracy promotion. We promote transparency and we push out good governance, and it's all the kinds of things that we do. And for Putin, that is deeply threatening. So we have a problem right from the beginning that he has a certain mindset. He doesn't understand how our systems works because he doesn't think it's important. He just thinks it's important to be able to basically find the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of the leaders to persuade them to do something. And he also believes that we're out to get him. So one of the biggest problems that we have in setting off on trying to forge a new relationship with Russia is to restore some kind of trust again to the relationship, basic trust. Another problem is Putin has actually said he doesn't trust anyone but himself, which is again why we can't figure out what he's thinking, because he actually, it seems within the inner circle, doesn't tell people either. In every interview that I have done to try to get a sense of the man, most people will say, including the Foreign Minister Lavrov, that they don't really know what Putin thinks on a particular issue unless it's a narrow issue that he's interacted with them on. So we have a person who is very difficult to get to have a one-on-one dialogue with. We have someone who thinks that we're out to get them, someone who doesn't trust people, and someone who is basically at the centre of a state right now where the general prevailing mindset is not particularly charitable towards us. So in other words, we have to have a fresh start. This is not the Soviet Union, it's not the Russia of Yeltsin, it's not the Gorbachev era, and Russia's not China, it's not Iran or any of the other countries that we have a difficulty with. It's a long-established European player. And sanctions in this kind of mindset are clearly not going to work to change Russian behaviour. There's no sign so far that they're doing anything. In fact, they're seen as punishment and our own form of intimidation. So again, there's no obvious answer here. We've actually, I think, got to go back to the drawing board and really start to think long and hard about what kind of relationship can we have, what kind of framework can we have, and how do we start to craft a dialogue. And as much as it pains me to say, given my gender, I think, basically having women as the primary interlocutor with Putin in his pat-san mentality is also not going to work. So we're going to have to also be very careful about how we create the image of our dialogue as well. Putin has to be able to look like he's still the tough guy in charge for his own politics. And he's going to posture all the more if we put him in positions that actually seem to make him lose face. Now, we know that in other settings, and we're quite careful about it. So we're going to actually have to craft a very careful approach, and we have to work very hard on that with Europe, as well, because it's very much also about the dialogue that Russia has with Europe. That's where the real relationships are. But right now, we're not in that place, and I think we're going to have to really do a lot of hard thinking about how we get there.
Yes.
So Putin has basically nationalized the school textbook industry, and he runs the carefully run youth camps now. So I was wondering if you could discuss the other ways in which Putin has kind of undertaken the education of Russian citizens.
Okay, so the question, for those of you who didn't hear it, is that the school textbooks have been nationalized, and these various youth groups have been created, all to sort of shape the opinion of youth. And what are the other ways in which the government's sort of trying to accomplish that objective?
Well, it's actually been very much part of a highly orchestrated and highly targeted policy. In fact, a couple of years ago, and I've got a section about this in the book, the Kremlin actually put out an RFP, a request for proposals, for different groups, task forces to be set up to think about how they could actually shape patriotic opinion across the country at large, especially in the youth. I mean, the youth groups were one of Putin's ideas, actually. He was quite regretful that the Komsomol had been disbanded. He wasn't so upset about the Communist Party disappearing, but he liked the idea of the Komsomol. I mean, basically a youth group to help inculcate patriotic thought among the impressionable Russians. The school textbook's been a very important part of this. There's also been other kind of declarations on history. Putin actually has paid a lot of attention to history, Russian history specifically. He has circumscribed the way that World War II can be talked about in many respects, kind of outlawing anything that puts the Soviets' conduct in World War II in a bad light. Obviously, he's been very effective at manipulating history and depictions of history in the case of Ukraine, where Ukraine has been depicted, actually, in many respects, as being at the forefront of the Holocaust and of many of the atrocities of World War II. Clearly, a lot of terrible atrocities were perpetrated on the soil of Ukraine, but of course it was occupied by Nazi Germany during World War II. Ukraine wasn't an independent agent, it was also part of the Soviet Union. But all of this has become part of a historiography that Putin has deliberately created around this. Some of the polls about famous leaders have been orchestrated also by the Kremlin. It turns out that the Kremlin itself has played with some of these polls to create again an image of the kind of leaders that Russians should look towards. Then there's been the use of PR. We didn't really get into that, but Putin has these talk shows. He has these call-in sessions where literally millions of people call in from around the country. Now, obviously, he can't answer millions of questions, but for weeks up until then, he has people calling in with questions, and thousands of people fielding the calls and then trying to categorize the kinds of questions. He has focus groups of foreign analysts. I've taken part in several of these, one called the Valdai Discussion Club that's been taking part since 2004, where he, and sometimes Medvedev when he was in that role, would meet with foreign analysts and experts and people from the media. So all of this is part of the shaping of opinion. And they've also been very effective in cutting off alternative sources of opinion. Now, it's true that there are lots of alternative sources still out there, but for the most part, TV and radio, but particularly TV, are very much dominated by state television. And other outlets have been dwindled down either by attacks on the advertising base or basically, accusations of corruption and taking away the licenses. I mean, you can still, obviously in hotels see international TV stations, but Putin's been very effective on constraining the media space. And in the internet, although Russia hasn't censored it in the way that the Chinese have, they've filled it with their own content, with the loyal bloggers and, kind of other people who have been encouraged to fill that space. And of course here in the US we have Russia Today, and Russia Today RT, Russia's flagship program, is in most major language broadcasting now, well, you can't say that's the same for other channels. Now, of course, we are in a situation where I wouldn't say that we should counteract that either. I don't want to see a return to the Cold War where the US government and Western governments are trying to blanket. It won't work, because TV and the media these days are entertainment. They're not just about information. And Russia television and Russian film and everything is actually immensely entertaining. They've taken an awful lot of the great media skills and the IT, very creative. And if you watch Russian television, they have the same kind of approach that we do in terms of our very entertaining television creating a certain kind of image. There's been a lot of use of documentary film and Hollywood-style films. Interestingly now, there's actually a backlash against the Russian film that's up for an Oscar, because some people are seeing this as not really depicting a good image of the country. But nonetheless, I mean, Russian film is not the stodgy old film of the Soviet era either. So Russia is playing very effectively also in the global cultural wars.
I would like to ask you a question about Nashi, which was a great pet project of Putin's. Recently, there hasn't been much going on that, if you could shed light. And my second question is about sort of little Putins in Eastern Europe, going from Hungarian Orbans to Czech president, and very much sympathizers of Putin, if you have the insight of Putin's appeal in former post-Soviet republics.
So what was the first? I'm sorry, I
The
missed
one is
it.
about Nashi.
Nashi.
I'll just
Okay,
refer
yes,
to that quickly. Nashi, the group, which is the youth group that is sort of, but not really, modelled on the Komsomol, hasn't disappeared. In fact, Putin goes every year to an annual camp that they have in Lake Seliger, and he usually makes big pronouncements there. And this has really kind of grown. I think the point that we're not seeing so much about it here in the West is it's become kind of old news. But it's now well established, and it has an awful lot of activists. But there have been lots of other formats of other groups as well that Putin has tended to meet with. So I think it has been a pet project, but it also has managed to establish itself and become part of the system that he's created around him. I think on the leadership issue, I'd like to hear more from Archie about this, because Putin's created a sort of style of leadership that's very popular. I mean, it doesn't mean that people like Viktor Orban or even President Erdogan are really emulating Putin entirely. They all come from very different backgrounds, and again, Putin is quite unique of coming from his KGB background and being very much the kind of person who has learned how to target individuals. He himself says that his two greatest skills are working with people and working with information. And that's not those are great skills also for politicians, he's pointed out, but he's particularly adept at them. And I don't think that Orban and Erdogan, for example, are operating in quite the same kinds of systems, but that style of leadership particularly, the rather macho element of Putin's has been quite popular with Erdogan, who makes similar kinds of pronouncements and about women and about what people should do. He even goes beyond where Putin, I think, would even stray. But he seems to be the one who's picked up a little bit more of the Putin style than others. But Archie, I mean, what do you think about Putin's leadership?
Just very briefly, Putin will sometimes publicly humiliate people, even someone like Deripaska, one of the so-called oligarchs, one of the Russian billionaires, for the public benefit in front of TV. And so that is a very macho style, as Fiona said. Yeltsin used to do some of that as well. Gorbachev didn't. Roald Sagdeyev, a very interesting man who was head of Soviet space research, and then married the granddaughter of President Eisenhower, something that could only happen in the Perestroika period, inconceivable before Perestroika, because he was an integral part of the Soviet military-industrial complex. He said that when he was with Gorbachev that he found that unlike any Soviet leader or any Soviet party high official he'd ever come across, Gorbachev actually tried to persuade people rather than just giving an order and telling them to do it. He actually spent a lot of time trying to persuade people that what he was advocating was right. I don't think Putin spends much time doing that. I mean, when one of these television programs Fiona mentioned, of course, then he has to publicly explain. But when he's taking decisions, he takes decisions. And this seems to be admired, this sort of macho style of decision making. But in the long run, it comes unstuck. That and more decisions are referred up to the top, and so either important decisions don't get taken, or they get taken on the basis of superficial knowledge. So I think there are inherent, to come back to an earlier question of Bill's, there are inherent instabilities in the system, and change can happen quite suddenly in Russia, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And the leadership style of Putin, which I think is an undesirable leadership style, it's certainly not democratic, it's not especially collegial, but it does seem to be one which resonates with the Russian public, unfortunately.
Comment, please, on the effectiveness, not perhaps so much the wisdom, but the effectiveness of current American policy towards Putin and Russia, specifically the imposition of the stringent economic sanctions, the saber rattling along the border with joint military exercises in the Baltic states, and then most importantly, the conscious decision to increase oil production, knowing the devastating effect it would have on world price and the Russian economy. Those three aspects.
Yeah, I'll make some quick comments on these. Sanctions actually haven't really been very effective in terms of changing behavior. In combination with the oil price, they've been very effective in, but it's been mostly the oil price going down, in wreaking havoc on the Russian economy. But that in itself wasn't supposed to be the goal of the sanctions. And I think that there's some real inherent risk in that as well. If the Russian economy goes into a free fall, and I think we've been talking about this now, that really increases all of the risks of having even more of a backlash from Putin. And also, I would argue, takes away a lot of the incentives that Russia and Putin might have of thinking about an alternative approach. Putin actually has been very keen on trading and doing business with the West, with Europe and with the United States. It's the one thing that he's actually kept stressing, and he just stressed in his most recent remarks about wanting to keep Russia as integrated as possible in the Russian economy. But he's not going to do that at the expense of Russia being basically brought back to the kind of same position it was in the 1990s. Now, that's not so likely if he keeps his eye on the macroeconomic situation. But Putin doesn't want to throw away all of Russia's reserves, its foreign currency reserves, to prop up the ruble either. Putin basically came away from the collapse of the Soviet Union realizing that another reason that the Soviet Union could have been kept together, if, not just if Gorbachev hadn't undertaken radical reform, economic and political, was if the oil price had been higher and if Russia hadn't been so indebted. Basically when Putin came into power, Russia only had about $6 billion worth of reserves. Now, the reserves have been spending that in a week, according to the latest press reports, but they've still got well over 300 billion. And at one point, they had 600 billion. And for Putin, those reserves are as essential and as vital to Russian security as nuclear weapons are in the Russian military. So he's going to be very careful about stewarding those. And we don't seem to have really kind of fully processed this. So the more that we keep punishing the Russian economy, the more that we're going to make Putin think that we are out to get them. Because, of course, as we've been making clear, I think, that Putin's success since he came into office in 1999-2000 has been on this growing economy and this economic success. So we will look like we're trying to topple him by creating crisis in the Russian economy. And that was not what sanctions were supposed to do. They were supposed to inflict some pain and punishment to do what we've been trying to do with Iran, to get Putin to the negotiating table. So they haven't done that. In fact, they've kind of created even more, I would say, bad behaviour from our perspective in Ukraine. Now, when it comes to the sabre rattling, that's a bit, to make too much of a pun, a double-edged sabre. Because on the one hand, it's not also very effective, and it makes Putin, again, double down. But on the other hand, if we don't appear tough, Putin just, actually also dismisses us. Because part of this whole mentality is he's trying to see how weak we are. And then Lenin had this axiom, if you, kind of push in a bayonet or a sabre, if you, keep on pushing, but if you hit steel, pull back. And I think there is an argument to be made that as, NATO has sabre-rattled and built up the defences, Putin's been a bit more cautious. Putin does not want to have a huge conventional military war with the West, with NATO. He's got more this hybrid approach of doing all kinds of different things to basically win an advantage, but he doesn't want a huge blow-up. He doesn't really want a World War III in the way that World War I and World War II were fought. This is an economic, a financial, an information war, an intelligence war. He's really fighting a kind of insurgency, by a state in this regard. So he doesn't want to change that. And that sabre-rattling, has shown him that, that NATO actually, if it gets kicked in the behind enough, will actually step up and do something. And he's trying to test where it will do something. We've said it won't be in Ukraine. So this is a bit difficult. Again, we have to get to the question before. We have to be a bit more sophisticated about it. The oil issue is very tricky. Putin thinks that this is a conspiracy between the US and Saudi Arabia. I think, sitting here, know that the Saudis aren't doing us any favours here either. And the Saudi oil minister has been quite clear that the Saudis are doing themselves a favour. They're not going to reduce production because they don't want to use their market share. And they haven't liked this, higher production oil and gas flooding the market from the US or Russia or anywhere else. The Saudis still can produce oil much cheaper than anyone else can. So they're going to hold on to their market share. So there's nothing really that Putin can do on the oil price. But the oil price is really, I think, the big determinant for him. If the oil price goes back up and starts rising again, the Russian economy will go back up again as well. And then, sanctions will hurt much less. And in fact, the sanctions are more likely to change the whole pattern of relations from what they were in the past. There's going to be a lot less of the interactions between the Russian and the US, and well, there wasn't much interaction with the US economy anyway, but the European economy, because Putin has started to look for other trading partners. He doesn't really want to be stuck completely with the Chinese, because the Chinese play hardball. They're even more macho than Putin is. He's having a hard time even with the Turks. So we hear in recent press about getting the deal for this new pipeline into Turkey. But he's been looking elsewhere. He's been looking at Brazil, he's been looking at India. They're all out in Davos, because remember, the Swiss are not part of the sanctions either. So Putin is looking for other approaches, and we might end up at the end with a lot less of the integration that we had before that would help us put the relationship on a different footing when we eventually get back to dialogue. So we're in a bind. And I keep getting colleagues at Brookings say, well, what do you do? And to be honest, I don't really know. So I'm still kind of figuring it out. So if anyone has any ideas, come and see me afterwards. But I'm trying to figure this out as well. Archie, do you have any?
No, I've nothing to add to what Fiona said very well.
So one last question. I think there was one back here.
Thank you both for those very enlightening comments. But I would just like to turn back to comments you made out at the beginning, which tie the leadership style in Russia to political culture. And our questions so far have really sort of revolved around the person of Putin. But it seems as though there's sort of the big elephant in the room is the Russian political culture. Because in your narrative, it seems as though leaders that have deviated from that strong macho posturing have been punished. And so So there's sort of this short-term gain when engaging with Putin, but the big thing is the political culture, and that seems so intractable, certainly in the short term. So what's to be done, really, to engage here outside of confronting the big, messy thing, political culture?
Bill, could you summarize the question? When I was here 30 years ago, I wasn't as deaf as this, and now I don't hear the questions.
So the question really is, asks you both to think about the intractability and in effect of Russian political culture. You've both been talking a lot about, you both referred to political culture as the backdrop to an analysis of Putin individually, but didn't go into much detail on the substance of Russian culture and how permeable or how changeable it might be. And I think the suggestion is if it's as entrenched as you've described it, then what are the possibilities for engaging with it?
And there was the observation that the weaker leaders, or the leaders who are perceived as weaker, milder, like Gorbachev, get punished by the system. And Putin himself often says the weak get beaten, so as well. So that's kind of a...
Stalin said that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question. And one great advantage the concept political culture has, and the old-fashioned idea of national character, is that we do understand, or should understand, that political cultures can change. But they tend to change rather slowly. And the change, a democratic political culture emerges along with good experience of democratic institutions. So a country like Czechoslovakia, when it became communist, there was tremendous enthusiasm for building socialism in Czechoslovakia after the war, but people had experience between the wars of a democratic political system, and soon even people who had been members of the Communist Party, many young enthusiastic members of the Communist Party, thought this was not the kind of new world that they had envisaged, and they had a standard of comparison of democratic Czechoslovakia between the wars to draw upon. Russia has never had that standard of comparison. Nevertheless, democratic values were becoming stronger in the late 1980s. When people, for example, in a survey were asked to rank a whole lot of values, including freedom and order, in the late 1980s, freedom came at the top and order was close to the bottom. 10 years later, order was at the top and freedom was way low down. And so people's actual experience with democratic institutions matters. But it was all too short, that period in which Russia was becoming a freer country and more democratic by the week. Unfortunately, the Yeltsin era, Fiona in her book also takes a rather dim view of the Yeltsin era, as I do. There was too much enthusiasm, I think, in the West for it, and it was called democracy, and Russians were told this was democracy. But what they saw was extreme inequality and a lot of arbitrariness, and it was a pretty low-level democracy insofar as it was democracy. So it was pretty discredited by the end of the Yeltsin era, and so now we've got a reaction against it. So I think at the moment, you're seeing kind of more traditional Russian political culture, those sort of values coming to the fore. Surveys now show far less support for liberal democratic values than they did at the end of the 1980s. Now, that's not to say that Russia is doomed to authoritarian rule for eternity. I don't believe it is. And one encouraging thing in the late Soviet period, indeed, it was part of the reason why communism declined as it was, but more and more people became educated, and the more higher education they had, the less satisfied they were by being treated like small children who should be seen but not heard, and Victorian children at that. I would hope that once again, the Russians, one thing that hasn't changed is Russians still have freedom of travel, and the young Russians who live in the West or spend time in the West, they can see that a Western political system, a Western democratic political system has got certain advantages. some of them, of course, may not return to Russia. Some of those who do may be more critical of what they find. So I think, in the long run, there are, of course, opportunities for a democratic political culture and a democratic political system to develop in Russia, but, these things are not innate. They develop in association with democratic experience and democratic institutions. And at the moment, as far as democratic institutions are concerned, Russia is going backwards.
It's just one thing I want to add to this and listening to it, because, in many respects, we're partly, to blame for this sort of state of affairs as well, because we gave an impression for a long time that there was only one way to do things, where, kind of, in many respects, there are many ways to democracy, or forms of democracy, into these freedoms that you see around the world. There's not just one way. And that was kind of, I think, part of the problem of the 1990s, that a lot of our own sort of political consultants, went over to Russia and said, look, you have to do it this way, this way, this way, and this way. And that kind of has also been discredited as well. And we seem to have not allowed this sort of space for people to find, their own path. And this conception of sovereign democracy that came up under Putin was a reaction to that. It was like saying, you guys have got a mess. Look at this. There's this mess in your politics, which is actually hard to deny, really, when we look around actually at our own political system at times. And we have the right to be able to sort of choose our own democracy and do it our own way. But most people know that it's really kind of an imitation that they have right now, and that was actually the root of the protests against Putin. Those were political protests. They weren't economic protests. They were protests from the kind of people that Archie was talking about, who wanted something different. Now, they weren't saying that they wanted a particularly, totally different political system, but there were hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets of Moscow and in other cities saying that they wanted political choice. So they already wanted alternatives. They wanted to have real political parties, ones that had come up from the grassroots, not that had been created by the Kremlin. And so, they were out there voting for the communists, or they were voting, for other parties as a sort of a protest, but also because, they wanted to have the opportunity to cast a vote and take part in governance. And they thought that under Medvedev they were being given that chance. So I think that there is the prospect for a kind of an opening up and a pluralization of the system. And there's still a lot of voices, even in the circles close to Putin, calling for something like that. But it's not going to happen under a wartime scenario. One of the people who's been making a very effective call for this is Alexei Kudrin, who was Putin's former finance minister. In fact, the guy who brought him to Moscow in 1996, somebody he worked with for a long time in St. Petersburg, and then was the longest-serving finance minister of Russia. And Kudrin has been on the outside of the government, but clearly still in the inner circle. And he's been saying that there needs to be some degree of change and some kind of opening up, and that Russia needs to be integrated still into the Russian economy. He's very into the global economy. He's really very worried of a return to autarky, or the country becoming closed down and all the people who want to have some kind of change leaving, which is also happening. Although it's small numbers, in comparison, it's still the people who will bring forward change. But he doesn't want to change the system overall. And I think that's something that we're going to have to accept. Maybe that's part of the solution. Instead of harping on all the time about, they're doing this wrong or they're doing that wrong, maybe we should just be keeping the door open for engagement and dialogue and letting people make up themselves their minds about where they want to take things, and giving space for the people who are still somewhat within the orbit of this one-boy network for be able to push for change, because it won't happen in a state of antagonism where if any step is taken is seen to be treachery or a betrayal or the work of a fifth column. And I think part of the problem is that democracy and the force for change has been too much associated with Western NGOs and with Western financing. And that was kind of part of the problem of the opposition movement. Putin was able to claim that everybody was a fifth column. Now, kind of, again, in some cases, some of the NGOs were almost entirely based on Western financing. That wasn't the truth for all of them. So I think we're just going to have to be a bit more patient and see, how things grow up from the bottom. But that does mean keeping an open door and keeping an open door for dialogue, at the same time as appearing tough. Which, again, I don't know how we do this. So this is it. So we have to find our own leadership style of being tough enough and yet, kind of also open enough in dealing with this. And maybe actually going to need a new book. The real strong leader.
Well, thank you very much for an enormously illuminating and informative evening. It's been, I think, Jim Burns would have been very pleased with the discussion, if depressed by what you had to say about what was going on in Russia. But I think we came to that conclusion when we talked about the American political system as well. So there's two wonderfully illuminating, informative, yet ultimately somewhat discouraging discussions about political leadership and political process. Thank you very much.
Thank you.